In 1860, the United States was a country still figuring out what it was. The Civil War had not yet started. The Transcontinental Railroad did not exist. Standard Oil was a decade away. J.P. Morgan was a young man working in his father's banking house. Carnegie was still a telegraph operator. Rockefeller was selling produce. 50 years later, 6 family dynasties controlled more of the American economy than the federal government itself. They did not conquer America with armies, they did it with timing. And the timing, when you look closely at it, is the strangest part of the whole story. Because 1860 is not just when the Gilded Age began. It is also, according to a growing body of alternative researchers, approximately when the evidence for a previous American civilization starts going quiet. The grand architecture, the canal systems that predate European settlement, the mud flood layers buried under city streets, the buildings that official history cannot explain and mostly refuses to try. What was left behind after that civilization disappeared was not an empty continent, it was an infrastructure. Roads that were already there, waterways that had already been cut, land that had already been cleared, and a population that had no memory of who built any of it, because the people who might have remembered had been removed, died, or were never taught to ask. 6 families stepped into that vacuum, and what they built on top of it became the modern United States. The first family is the Rockefellers. John D. Rockefeller founded Standard Oil in 1870 in Cleveland, Ohio. Within a decade, Standard Oil controlled approximately 90% of all oil refining in the United States. Not through invention, not through discovery, through acquisition, through secret railroad rebate agreements, and through the systematic elimination of every competitor who could not be bought or broken. The oil fields of Pennsylvania, which Rockefeller used as his foundation, had been producing since 1859, 1 year before the supposed beginning of modern American history. Researchers working outside the mainstream have noted something that rarely appears in Standard Oil history. The infrastructure surrounding the early Pennsylvania oil fields was, in several documented cases, already partially in place before the drillers arrived. Canal systems, graded roads, stone foundations, explained away as coincidence or as early pioneer construction, but inconsistent in their scale with what the recorded settler population could have built in the time available. Rockefeller did not build a system. He occupied one. And then he used the railroads to control who else could use it, which brings us to the second family, the Vanderbilts. Cornelius Vanderbilt began accumulating railroad lines in the 1860s, eventually consolidating what became the New York Central Railroad, connecting New York City to Chicago across a route that, in significant stretches, followed paths that had clearly been traveled for a very long time before any European recorded traveling them. The grade profiles were too good, the curves too gentle, the passes through terrain too conveniently placed for routes supposedly being mapped from scratch. Railroad historians have occasionally acknowledged in technical literature that does not reach popular audiences that early railroad surveyors repeatedly found evidence of prior road construction along routes they were supposedly pioneering. They attributed this to Native American trails, but Native American trails were footpaths. They were not engineered to the grades that early railroad surveys documented. Someone else had been through those mountains, someone with tools and knowledge of civil engineering. And the Vanderbilts built their empire on top of the routes those unknown engineers had already solved. By the 1880s, Vanderbilt rail lines controlled most freight movement between the American Northeast and Midwest. The family's wealth became essentially a tax on everything that moved through the country's most productive economic corridor. The third family is the Carnegies. Andrew Carnegie's steel empire was built in Pittsburgh, a city whose geographic advantages, rivers, proximity to coal and iron ore, natural transportation corridors, had been recognized and utilized long before Carnegie arrived. Carnegie Steel, which became U.S. Steel after J.P. Morgan purchased it in 1901 for the then staggering sum of $480 million, produced more steel than the entire country of Britain at its peak. Carnegie himself, in his autobiography, described Pittsburgh's geography as almost preternaturally suited for industrial production. He did not ask why. Researchers who have looked at Pittsburgh's pre-industrial landscape have found evidence of extensive earth modification, level terraces, and buried structural remains that do not fit neatly into the known history of the region. The city sits at the confluence of three rivers in a bowl of hills that seems, from aerial imagery, almost deliberately shaped. Carnegie found it that way. He simply added furnaces. The fourth family is the Morgans. J.P. Morgan is the one name in American financial history that even mainstream historians will acknowledge held power that exceeded any elected official of his era. In 1907, when the American banking system teetered on the edge of total collapse, Morgan personally organized the bailout. He locked the country's most powerful bankers in his private library and did not let them leave until they agreed to a rescue plan he had designed. The federal government had no mechanism to do what Morgan did in that week. Morgan financed Carnegie's steel consolidation. He financed Edison's electrical empire and then reorganized it into General Electric. He financed the railroad mergers that put Vanderbilt-era lines under unified control. He was, functionally, the central bank of the United States before the Federal Reserve existed, an institution whose creation in 1913 Morgan's allies had spent years lobbying for, and whose structure reflected Morgan's view of how monetary control should work. The Morgan family represented something the other five families needed but could not individually supply: the mechanism of credit itself. Without Morgan-controlled banks deciding who received financing and on what terms, the oil fields, the railroads, and the steel plants could not have scaled at the speed they did. Morgan did not own the physical infrastructure. He owned the permission to build it. The fifth family is the Astors. The Astor fortune began with fur trading and became generational through Manhattan real estate. John Jacob Astor, who died in 1848 as the wealthiest man in America, had spent decades acquiring land in lower Manhattan at prices that reflected a remarkable confidence in what that land would eventually be worth. Historians explain this as shrewd speculation, but the pattern of Astor land acquisition, mapped across the decades of his activity, traces almost perfectly the footprint of what became the modern financial and commercial core of New York City. Astor bought land as though he already knew where the city would grow. He bought it around transportation nodes that did not yet exist. He bought it along corridors that would not be developed for another generation. Either he was the most prescient real estate investor in American history, or he had access to plans for the development of Manhattan that were not publicly available because they predated the American city entirely. The landmass of Manhattan, researchers in the alternative history community have noted, shows signs of prior extensive modification. The island's original topography, reconstructed from early colonial surveys, included graded areas, filled sections, and leveled elevations that are inconsistent with a purely natural landscape. By the time the Astors were buying it, Manhattan's geography had already been partially engineered by hands that history does not name. The sixth family is the Hearsts. William Randolph Hearst inherited silver mining wealth from his father George and converted it into the first modern media empire. At his peak in the 1930s, Hearst owned 28 major newspapers, reaching 20% of American newspaper readers, a film production company, radio stations, and a wire service that fed content to outlets he did not directly own. Hearst understood something that the other five families eventually came to appreciate. Controlling what people believed about history was as valuable as controlling oil or steel or land. His newspapers did not just report events, they shaped what events the public knew about and how those events were framed. Stories that fit his editorial view received prominent national coverage. Stories that did not were ignored or buried. The alternative history community has paid particular attention to Hearst because of one specific episode. In the early 20th century, a significant movement existed among amateur archaeologists, antiquarians, and independent researchers to document and publicize evidence of pre-Columbian advanced civilization in North America. The physical evidence was substantial. Anomalous architectural remains, unexplained earthwork systems, skeletal finds inconsistent with conventional population history, artifacts with no agreed-upon origin. Hearst newspapers gave this research essentially zero coverage during the decades of his dominance. The Smithsonian Institution, which had been receiving anomalous artifacts from across the country since the 1880s, developed under the same period what researchers now call an active suppression policy. Artifacts that did not fit the approved model of North American prehistory were removed from display, reclassified, or in documented cases, destroyed. The coordination between institutional archaeology and the media apparatus that could have publicized dissenting findings produced by the early 20th century a public that had essentially no awareness that a legitimate historical debate was occurring. What ties these 6 families together is not conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It is something more structural than that. They each arrived at a moment of historical rupture when an older order had ended and a new one had not yet been defined. They each moved into physical infrastructure, geographic advantages, and financial voids that their own bootstrapped efforts could not plausibly explain. And they each, in their respective domains, developed mechanisms for controlling the narrative about what America was, where it came from, and who had built it. The Tartaria question, the question that researchers outside mainstream academia have been asking with increasing urgency, is not whether a previous civilization existed in North America before European settlement. The physical evidence for prior occupation, prior engineering, and prior urban development is too widely distributed and too well documented in primary sources to dismiss. The question is what happened to it, who knows about it, and who has benefited from the gap in public understanding that its disappearance created. 6 families divided a continent between them after 1860. They built empires in oil, steel, rail, banking, land, and media. They built them fast. They built them on geographic and infrastructural advantages that conventional history struggles to account for, and they built institutions specifically designed to control what the public understood about the world they were inheriting. The country they built is the country we still live in. The history they permitted is the history most people still believe. And the continent underneath all of it, the older continent, the one with the canals and the earthworks and the architecture and the roads that were already there when the surveyors arrived, has been waiting under the surface of the official story for a very long time. Nobody told you it was there. Now you know someone made sure of that.